Baudrillard. I kind of like this photograph of Baudrillard, and it shows him smoking a cigarette, very much a kind of unreconstructed, shall we say, Frenchman. And he's very much a controversial figure in many ways, partly because of some of his comments that have outraged feminists around the world. He's certainly outraged many Americans. What is he? Is he a sociologist? Is he a philosopher? Is he a kind of provocateur? In many ways, he's all of these things. But his book, Simulacra and Simulation, was voted, I noticed on Amazon, is the top book in philosophy, so we can certainly include him, top-selling book in philosophy, in our session today on philosophy. The question, of course, is to what extent he remains relevant today, and I really want to sort of ask that question because he died in 2007 before many of the kind of social media apps like Instagram, Facebook, Snapchat, Twitter, and so on had appeared on the scene, and many of the comments he was making back in the 80s and 90s were before even the internet and so on. And yet he managed in a very kind of prescient way to kind of talk about a culture that, if anything, has become more extreme. I just meant that you would have noticed there a clip from the movie The Matrix, and that's possibly what makes him very famous in the sense that this was a book that his book Simulacra and Simulation was the kind of behind the Matrix itself. So in many senses, I think Baudrillard, for all his kind of rather old-fashioned values in many ways, is very much a creature of our times, who was in some senses very prescient about the world. We'll talk more about the Matrix later. What I want to do today is essentially to give some background, first of all, to where Baudrillard comes from in terms of the kind of cultural values of his time, and then talk about him and look at him basically through the lens of certain books and book titles that he did. What I'm going to give you is a little more than a kind of sketch of what Baudrillard is all about, but hopefully by the end of the session we'll have got into his work in much more detail. So let me start by mentioning Henri Lefebvre as in terms of the cultural background. Henri Lefebvre was on his doctoral committee along with Roland Barthes and Pierre Bourdieu, and that really situates him in a certain sort of culture. Lefebvre was somebody who was in many ways part of a kind of phenomenological outlook on life. He was critical about the obsession with oculocentrism, with a vision, and was interested in opening up our understanding of the world to the experience of the world. It was less a question of reading text than experiencing textures. And he has some very negative, critical comments to make about the architect who reduces the world to blueprints. And in many ways, this loss of lived experience in the way they see the world is a problem. As he mentions at the bottom, after its fashion, the image kills. And I think this is kind of like, in a way, the context from which he's coming. Not only that, but also the world of Roland Barthes as somebody deeply steeped in that. But if there's anyone who really does kind of, in many ways, situate him or could be compared to his work, it's Guy Debord, the provocative French intellectual who was the author of this very famous book, The Society of the Spectacle, that came out in 1967. And in many ways, the whole, unfortunately, I can't read what's on the top here. The point about this book is really summed up in the initial sentence of the whole book. Not only sort of situating it in the kind of the conditions of capitalism, but also pointing out that how all that was once lived has become mere representation. The notion of the spectacle doesn't refer to glasses as such, but more to a society of the spectacle, a society dominated by images in which we have somehow lost touch with a sense of lived experience. And he was part of a group called the Situationist International that was a group of radical artists and intellectuals who were challenging in many ways a number of things. The obsession with the image, of course, the obsession with commodification. And in a time when, before really television, before advertisements had really taken off, they could see already the problems of this particular world. I love my camera because I love to live. And not long after the publication of the Society of the Spectacle, there was this astonishing event in Paris, May '68, an uprising among the students who were protesting about many things, not least these post-colonial kind of values in France, but also the commodification of everyday life. And it was interesting because it spread through to the rest of France, and there were wildcat strikes in many of the factories outside of Paris, and it also almost led to the toppling of the government. And what is interesting about this is the way in which this radical way of thinking was informed by not only Debord's thinking, but also people like Lefebvre and so on. Underneath the pavias are the beach. And it was part also, one could say, of a kind of counter movement in the whole of 60s culture that found itself also in the States, and the kind of protests against Vietnam, the kind of flower power protests going on. And one could also say, even in Eastern Europe, this is the Prague uprising in the 60s. It was very much part of a kind of counterculture. This was a kind of very critical approach towards the world. You can see maybe ramifications of it in the kind of work of people like Barbara Kruger later on, and also possibly in the world of kind of Occupy Wall Street, a kind of anti-capitalist critique of society as a whole. What I find interesting, and I devote a chapter in my book, Anesthetics of Architecture, to this question, is by comparison how complacent architectural culture was at the time. This is the book Learning from Las Vegas that came out in 1972 that was extremely popular. I'm not quite sure why. It's a great title for sure, but it doesn't have much insight in terms of content. It is interesting to see the kind of the privileging, the celebration of the image, of the spectacle in this book, when you compare it to the kind of radical critique going on in France at the time. And what is also interesting is the way that it aestheticizes all the kind of the issues of Las Vegas, of the gambling, the prostitution, and so on. It's simply offering a study of method, not content, but that itself, to my mind, is problematic in some senses. Most problematic of all, perhaps, is the image on the front cover of a highly sexist advertisement for suntan lotion, for Tan Hawaiian with Tanya, where Tanya has been in many ways decontextualized, desemanticized, and recoded as mere kind of ornamentation. And it was despite all this, and this of course was the kind of standard critique that the feminists would come up with this kind of to this kind of world. In many, what is interesting about this is that not only the kind of the radical way they're criticizing it. This is an advertisement for aftershave. Instead of it makes me feel like a new man, it makes me feel like puking up. Get your hands off our body. But it displays in some way how that society, the spectacle, contains within itself potentially some kind of self-critique, a kind of détournement of the process itself. And you could see this kind of, I would call it complacency, the superficiality, shall we say, extending to the architecture that Venturi, Scott Brown, and Eisenhower produced. This is a National Gallery extension in London. This supposedly witty reference to these different classical sort of styles. And you can see also in the interior of the staircase here what is kind of an interesting feature. If you look at these kind of what seem to be kind of the references to the cast iron, the railway architecture, the vaults of the railway stations in London. These seem to be a reference to that. But when you notice that these are sitting over windows, you realize they're not structural at all. And in fact, you can see a shadow line between them. These are simply added as a form of ornamentation. So without going into too much detail, I think we can see a radical contrast between the kind of what was going on in architecture and really what was going on in kind of critical intellectual circles in France at the time. So, Jean Baudrillard. What I want to do today is to really try and sketch out some a kind of overview of Baudrillard, of some of the kind of key ideas, without going into too much detail. And I want to do it through the medium of books, of book covers, and some of the thoughts, some of the kind of key strategies that themselves are contained within the title of these book covers. This book, Fatal Strategy, I won't go into the details of the book itself, but the term fatal strategies was something that was adopted. It was a strategy adopted by Baudrillard. In many ways, when he was arguing something, he would argue something in an extreme degree. In other words, he would exaggerate his point in order to get his message across. It was what he was offering was less a representation of reality than a transcendence of reality. And many of the titles, such as the Gulf War did not take place, of course, were outrageous and are seen in that way. But at the same time, this was a way of making his point. Another title of a book was The Ecstasy of Communication. And what I find astonishing about this is the way in which he could see the kind of way in which we were kind of overloaded in an information society by communication, by information. This information overload actually didn't lead to a society of information, but a society in which somehow information was devouring itself. It led to a kind of a society in a way bombarded by information, but with no information. A kind of society, a proliferation of consumerist images, empty of content. And that, of course, this was written in 1987, way before the internet really took off, way before mobile phones, cell phones appeared, way before the kind of the world of Instagram, Facebook, Snapchat, and Twitter. And yet he could sort of see what was happening. And in some senses, his message, therefore, is even more important today, it would seem. One of the key themes in Baudrillard's work is how we are detached, as it were, from reality. The Perfect Crime really is a story about the perfect crime of the 20th century, the theft of reality itself. And much of this is to do with the way that the world has become aestheticized. We mentioned the term aestheticization last week in the context of Walter Benjamin, and really in Baudrillard it takes on a more radical turn in many ways. Less dialectical in some senses, but the point here is that once art penetrates everything, the world is completely aestheticized. It is completely kind of rendered, in some ways, stripped, rinsed of its kind of social and political and economic kind of concerns. And you could see this also in the way that somehow the art world, everything becomes art. You get to a situation whereby you don't know what art is. It leads to a kind of breakdown of the definitions of all these things. And indeed, you could look at this in many different sort of ways. It's not just the question of aesthetics, it's also other things. When everything becomes historical, nothing is historical anymore. When everything becomes political, nothing is political anymore. And likewise, when everything becomes aesthetic, nothing is aesthetic anymore. We live in a trans-historical, trans-political, and trans-aesthetic world. As each category grows swollen and distended, a condition of obesity exists, and the contents are obliterated. Everything has been xeroxized into infinity. In this ecstasy of communication, this society of saturation, events have been lost in the void of information, deprived of all meaning. This is a comment from my book, Millennium Culture, that came out the same year as The Anesthetics of Architecture. Both books really focusing on Baudrillard's thinking. But perhaps the most provocative book was this one, written just after the Gulf War. Well, actually, it was written in 3 stages. It was based on an article that was published, initially first in The Guardian and in Libération in France. The Gulf War will not take place, which was written before the Gulf War itself took place. And then there was a second article, The Gulf War is not taking place, that was written during the Gulf War itself. And finally, a third essay, The Gulf War did not take place, which was written after the Gulf War. And without going into Baudrillard's particular reasonings about this kind of culture of simulation in which this war was in some ways acted out, it's fair to say that it happened as far as a Western media audience was concerned, as a kind of a media event, a televised media event. There are other events happening at the same time, such as the genocide in East Timor, that we knew nothing about because it didn't become a media event. And yet both were about oil. One was about protecting, they were both about protecting interests in oil. It was inconvenient to mention East Timor because there was at the time an agreement between the Australian government and Indonesia to exploit the extraction of oil. But I think precisely this kind of question of aestheticization also creeps into this. Aestheticization not only in terms of the individuals who were kind of executing that war, who were in some ways abstracted from that sort of world in sense, and brought up maybe on Space Invaders machines. So in some senses, or games like that, in some senses it was kind of seen in that abstracted way, but also in terms of an aestheticization that Bernard Shully refers to in one of his famous articles. A general form of aestheticization has indeed taken place, conveyed by the media, just as stealth bombers are aestheticized on the televised Saudi Arabian sunset, just as sex is aestheticized in advertising. So all of culture, and of course this includes architecture, is now aestheticized, xeroxized. Furthermore, the simultaneous presentation of these images leads to a reduction of history to simultaneous images, not only those of the Gulf War interspersed with basketball matches and advertisements, but also those of our architectural magazines and ultimately those of our cities. And I'm referring here not just simply to the kind of glossy magazine culture that we have in architectural culture, but also to some extent the kind of escapist culture of wallpaper in which somehow architecture is itself co-opted. Bernard Chaumier, I'd say, was at the center of all these things. He was kind of brought up in Paris he was educated in Paris during the 60s, and this was really very much part of his theoretical agenda at the time. And this is an image that I showed you last week about the Gulf War that can very easily be read as a kind of fireworks display. But what actually we're seeing are the instruments of war, missiles, rockets, anti-aircraft fire, but seen through this lens, the kind of the eerie green of the night sights. One can aestheticize this and see this as a dramatic kind of spectacle and rinse it of all the horror that is associated with it. This is precisely, in some senses, the problem of aestheticization. Seduction was also a famous book in many ways, and a somewhat controversial book. What Baudrillard means here by seduction is not sexual seductions, although sexual seduction is somehow annexed in some way within this kind of this scheme. He's more interested in the kind of two modalities of engagement that we have in our contemporary age, the difference, as it were, between interpretation and seduction. Seduction is about being caught within the surface images. Interpretation is about rupturing those surface images and digging deeper, looking for some underlying meaning. For Baudrillard, it's clear that seduction has won. Seduction has triumphed over interpretation. We live in a world of seductive kind of images. And alongside that was also some kind of critique of a kind of capitalism itself, in the sense that the notion of seduction was very different from early notions of seduction. He refers to ideas of courtly love, where seduction was much more kind of meaningful. Whereas for Baudrillard, it was all about somehow this kind of the obscene pornographic logic of the striptease, making things absolutely obvious and blatant in some senses, of which pornography would be a prime example. But when one thinks about the kind of culture of advertising and the way in which the kind of culture of seduction triumphs, it's kind of in many ways you can see what Baudrillard's getting at. In the old days, when I was a kid, you'd get people on television coming on and in an advertisement and trying to argue why a particular toothpaste or a particular washing powder made sense. Now it's just about one particular kind of image with a label and a kind of dream space, less about content and more about the kind of just simply this a kind of almost a dream image to dream yourself into, Prada, Gucci, Dolce & Gabbana, and so on. This is in many ways the culture of advertising today. And I was thinking also that in many ways what we were talking about last week in terms of Benjamin and Krakow, in the way in which somehow there's a kind of magical tinge to the way we operate things, or a mythical tinge to things. There was an argument made by Andrew Wernick, who says that basically it's not just a culture of the image, it's a culture of the promotional image, of branding and so on, which I completely agree with, but I think it goes beyond that. It's become the dream image or the wish image. You wear some Puma shoes and you get to run as fast as Usain Bolt. You wear some Adidas sportswear and you get to play soccer, football, as well as David Beckham. And it's also, of course, a deeply sexist one. The kind of the images of Tanya Weiner Tanya are kind of are summoned up here in the way that the female body is appropriated in this culture of advertising. No doubt it's for those people who want to buy a BMW. They dream of having someone like Gigi Hadid climbing into the car with them. It's a deeply kind of uncritical, sexist, superficial world, but at the same time, it is the world that has triumphed today. We live in a world of seduction. And this particular book, in many ways, reminded me of that in some sense. This was a book put together by Rem Koolhaas after his curatorship of the Venice Biennale. Every single room in one of the pavilions there had a book written about it. And then in the end, there was this massive book that was put out there, which to my mind was a complete kind of heroic failure, shall we say. Heroic failure that actually, in a sense, we live in a kind of soundbite culture, a culture of likes and dislikes where we don't get engaged in any way, a culture more like Björke Ingels than the culture of Rem Koolhaas. But that is the culture in many ways in which we live today. Perhaps the most infuriating book in some senses was this book that Baudrillard wrote about America. He took a kind of road trip around America And like many of the kind of several Europeans before him, de Tocqueville, also Umberto Eco, somewhat disparaging about life in America. There were, of course, others, such as Reyner Banham, who were completely enthralled by America. But Baudrillard, this road trip by the desert as a kind of cultural desert. And he makes a number of observations about that, the kind of culture of disappearance, the disappearance of all culture. And not only was America, for him, and he outraged feminists as well in some of the comments he was making about the desert, but it was not only just a culture, America was not a culture was not only without any culture, it was also without any identity. But as he puts it, they do have wonderful teeth. And it was it was America itself that in many ways opens up some of these kind of important questions that Baudrillard deals with. This idea that somehow Las Vegas, when it rises at nighttime, it plunges us into this stupefied, hyperreal euphoria that we would not exchange for anything else, and that is the empty and inescapable form of seduction. In the end, Baudrillard is, of course, seduced by seduction himself, even though he is, in some sense, critiquing it. This was a comment that was made in Simulacra and Simulation, in many ways his most famous book, for a number of reasons. I will outline just simply two today. One of them is the fact that he introduces the term hyperreality into the context of his thinking. Hyperreality is, in some senses, a term that goes beyond Debord. I once heard Baudrillard in a lecture, and somebody asked in the audience, "Your thinking reminds me of the work of Guy Debord," which was a kind of naive question, but actually his answer was very useful. And Baudrillard said, yes, well, when Debord was writing in the 60s, I completely agreed with him. But now we've entered into a further stage, the third order of simulation, where it's not simply a question of us having sort of the things being lost behind the culture of the image. The image has become our culture now. We are completely marooned in what he called hyperreality, a culture of images in which we have no reference in the real world itself. We've lost touch with reality. Reality has been stolen. And he uses the example of Disneyland to illustrate this particular context. What Baudrillard argues is that Disneyland presents itself as though it's an imaginary escapist kingdom where you escape from the kind of cultural values of America. Not so. According to Baudrillard, Disneyland is precisely a condensation of all those values. It is America. From the moment you park in the car park, the moment you take your last, milkshake, you are basically spending money. You are contributing towards Disney PLC. But the point that Baudrillard makes is that Disneyland, in pretending to be a kind of culture that is an imaginary world, becomes a prop to the world outside. It makes us believe that the world outside is real. In Disneyland is supposedly imaginary, the world outside is real, but of course both are precisely part of a hyperreal culture. They're both entrapped with that. And if Disneyland is no different to the world outside, then the world outside is no different to Disneyland. I was particularly struck by this advertisement that came out a long time ago. You can see Concorde flying in the top there, where it showed Disneyland on the right-hand side and put it alongside not only Versailles and Fontainebleau, but also the kind of monuments of Paris. It struck me as an absurd thing that the culture that had given us the Chateau of Loire was going to be celebrating a fake chateau in Disneyland. It seemed also extraordinary that somehow Disneyland was equated with the Arc de Triomphe, with the Eiffel Tower, with Notre Dame, and so on. But when you think about it, actually, really what happens is that the whole of Paris itself has been appropriated as a form of Disneyland, as a form of kind of theme park. And these monuments are themselves kind of wrapped up in this kind of culture of hyperreality. Not only the Eiffel Tower, the Arc de Triomphe, and Notre Dame, but also Versailles, Fontainebleau, and all those other cultural monuments. They can become part of this whole thing. And not only that, but also, one could say, the rest of, let's say, the cultural heritage of Europe. Venice, precisely, is a form of theme park, a form of Disneyland. And likewise, places like the Bauhaus, they become a kind of thematized Disneyland. And here you can kind of see this in some senses. The kind of, you go to the Chateau on the Loire, and you go for your le weekend and you go and have le picnic in the garden there and you enjoy this kind of spectacle, but you enjoy it rinsing it of all the kind of the reality of what it was, what it came from. And I don't know where the money came to build this, whether it came from the slave trade or whatever. It's all kind of decontextualized into this escapist kind of wallpaper domain, where we are somehow removed from reality and in this kind of hyperreal condition. Roll up for the hyperreal coach tour of Europe. And in many ways also we can see relationships or comparisons or points of intersection between the theme of hyperreality and the theme of virtual reality. And I'll maybe say a few words about that later. But what is Baudrillard perhaps most famous for is the fact that the movie The Matrix was supposedly based on simulacra and simulation. Apparently the actors were asked to be involved in to read the copy of this, and in the movie itself, as you can see, simulacra and simulation plays a kind of a role. Indeed, Baudrillard himself was invited to be part of the sequel to the Matrix, but for him it was a travesty. They misunderstood the condition in which we find ourselves. According to one review of this I read, Baudrillard takes the view that really the problem about the Matrix is it assumes that we can step out of this condition, out of this kind of culture of simulation, and see the world as it is, in some ways a bit like the story of Plato's cave, whereby philosophy allows us to emerge from this kind of simulacra, this culture of shadows or representations, to see the world as it is. But according to Baudrillard, we're absolutely completely trapped in it. There is no escape. We are marooned in this kind of hyperspace of hyperreality, and there's no way out. So Baudrillard was very highly dismissive of the movie and didn't take part in any way in the sequel itself. So let me just finally sum up with a kind of few comments about what are in some senses the limitations of Baudrillard's thinking. I mean, I think that his thinking is highly provocative, highly radical, and highly thought-provoking, albeit problematic for all the reasons that I've outlined in terms of his views on the way in which he upset certain people, especially his very misogynistic sort of views. But nonetheless, I think he has an important role to play as a provocateur in opening up these kind of questions. But you have to ask certain. You have to challenge him in many ways. I mean, when was this moment when we were in touch with reality? If we see this kind of progression, when we move from a world in which we are in touch with reality to a world, let's say, of the spectacle, the society of the spectacle, to the world of the third order simulations, when we've completely lost touch with reality, when was this moment, this kind of original kind of paradise in some senses, when we were in touch with reality? When was this moment when we were free of any kind of any questions of problematic issues of gender, of racism, of slavery, or of whatever else? I mean, the point is, there was no such time. There was no sort of golden age in the past, it would seem to me. Also, we can sort of begin to sort of see this in the context of other critiques in some senses. In many ways, the work of Slavoj Žižek is kind of interesting, especially in the context of virtual reality. In an essay he wrote on virtual reality, which is called From Virtual Reality to the Virtualization of Reality, he points out in many ways that reality is already virtualized. For Žižek, the world outside comes to us through the maze of the imagination, through a detour of the maze of the imagination. And fantasy, far from being seen in opposition to reality, is precisely a lens by which we look at reality. In other words, we fantasize about reality itself. And this leads him to the conclusion that what virtual reality teaches us is not how virtual reality is, but rather how virtual reality itself is. Let me say that one more time. What virtual reality teaches us is not how virtual reality is, but rather how virtual reality itself is. We never have access to reality if you take the kind of Lacanian perspective that Žižek buys into. Equally, one can look at this recent book that came out in the States this last week by Anil Seth, Being You, from a neuroscientific point of view, where the people are thinking about how we already have, as it were, a model of the world in our brain, And the brain has to offer certain predictions about what is happening out there. The brain is kind of locked into this kind of bony skull with only having these kind of vague electrical impulses, as it were, coming from the outside, and we have to guess what's out there. In other words, it's a form of predictive perception, or in Anil Seth's term, it's a form of controlled hallucination. We don't engage with the real. So these are in many ways kind of a challenge in some senses, what Baudrillard is saying. That it's not just, well, on the one hand, you could see them as kind of reinforcing it. We are removed from reality. But the point is, these are arguing that we will never engage directly with reality. It's always a kind of mediated interaction with reality itself. Then there is this question about the photographs. What is interesting about Baudrillard is that, and I went to an exhibition of his photographs once in Leicester in England, is that for someone who was so critical about the world of the image, it's remarkable how interested he was in photography. He published a book on photographs, and he, as I mentioned, has several exhibitions of photographs. One is left with a suspicion that there is a kind of, at the heart of Baudrillard's project, a kind of repressed fascination with the world of the image. Far from being critical about it, he's somehow seduced by it. And in some senses, one can see that through the logic of the standard critique, for example, of homophobia. If you think about the movie American Beauty, where the father, who comes across as deeply homophobic, towards the end of the film, we discover that he's kind of gay. The standard critique of homophobia is that people who might suspect they might be gay, they were in denial, and therefore they project it onto someone else and they criticize it and so on. It seems to me that the logic of repressed fascination is a fascinating one. And I've noticed that it seems to apply to Baudrillard as much as it applies to people like Paul Virilio. They seem to be attacking something, but at the same time, there is such an obsession with it, is that it's as though there is a kind of repressed fascination with it. So what are we left with Baudrillard? This was a recent exhibition in Shanghai of Baudrillard's photography. It seems that somehow he himself has been completely appropriated by the culture of hyperreality, the culture of the image that he was attacking so much, and maybe in which he was himself somehow in love. I want to finish my particular kind of with my presentation with just the final comment that came out of my book, The Anesthetics of Architecture, which was a highly provocative comment in some sense that turned the whole argument on its head. Could it be then that Baudrillard himself is the unwitting victim of his own prognosis, and that in the hyperreal world of the image, philosophy itself has become aestheticized as the ultimate icon of hyperreal culture? More especially within an architectural culture of depthless, seductive images and shimmering effects, philosophy always threatens to be appropriated as an intellectual veneer, a surface gloss. I mean, I say that because at the time I'd been to sort of reviews at the Architectural Association, where it was quite trendy for people at the time to quote Derrida or to quote Deleuze as a way of adding a certain sort of veneer to that to their work. In such a context, what is philosophy but a mere fashion accessory? And I think this points towards potentially one of the real problems about postmodernity, which is kind of that even opposition to to that kind of culture itself somehow gets co-opted. So that resistance, it devours its own kind of resistance. And we'll see that when we come to the work of also Frederick Jameson, who seems to kind of follow it. There's a similar idea in his work.